When we finished 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the establishment of the Reformed Episcopal Church. The Reformed Episcopal Church, just to close that topic, existed, technically speaking. Well, technically, I think it's still, they would say they still exist. But they were formed in 1873, and in the middle aughts, after Gene Robinson was made Bishop of New Hampshire and assorted parishes left the Episcopal Church, many of those that left formed something called the Anglican Church in North America. And the Reformed Episcopal Church joined the Anglican Church in North America. So at one level, I think they believe they still exist, but they're not a completely separate entity at the moment. So, having closed that loop, we're going back to the 1870s and 1880s. One of the key things that happened in 1871, while everybody, let me rephrase this. While the men of the church, sorry Tom, while the men of the church were debating regeneration and Anglo-Catholicism and establishing the Reformed Episcopal Church, a woman named Julia Emery and her sisters decided that the women in the Episcopal Church needed to have a role. And in 1871, Julia and her sisters formed what's called the Women's Auxiliary. Julia Emery and her sisters happened to be from Massachusetts, among other interesting points about them. And the Women's Auxiliary was going to offer a place for the women in the Episcopal Church to be able to meet, to be able to discuss the issues that they saw as being important, to be able to support their parishes and their families. At this point in time, bear in mind that when it came to serving on a vestry, being a deputy to General Convention, being ordained, only men could do all of the above. So from 1789 to 1871, there was not an official role for women in the Episcopal Church. And the Emery sisters sought to rectify that with the Women's Auxiliary. They also got really smart and decided that if they were going to be an auxiliary, they needed to have not just parish meetings, not just diocesan meetings, but they needed to have national meetings. And so they tied their national meetings to the time of General Convention. And so beginning in 1874, the Women's Auxiliary had their first triennial meeting, and they have met, along with General Convention, every 3 years since 1874. On other domestic fronts, in 1883, the Episcopal Church established the Conference of Church Workers Among Colored People. The idea here was to try to be more intentional in various parts of the church with regard to black parishes, as well as attracting more blacks into the Episcopal Church. The Southern Diocese, the former members of the Confederacy, came up with something that they called the Sewanee Canon. Now, Sewanee is, okay. Anyway, I was going to spell Sewanee for you, S-E-W-A-N-E-E. The Sewanee Canon was going to create non-geographical racial dioceses. In other words, within the South there would be a diocese for colored people, but it would not be the Diocese of South Carolina. So it might cover South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, some configuration of sorts.
It overlapped the other dioceses.
It would overlap the other dioceses, and the idea here was to separate blacks into these separate dioceses. General Convention lobbied against it. And at the 1883 convention, they lobbied furiously against it and defeated it. Okay? Part of their defeat of it was that the national church, which really, when I say national church, don't think today's national church and don't think 815, okay? The national church was this loose conglomeration of dioceses, okay? But the national church in General Convention didn't see this as a way forward, and they believed that the Conference for Church Workers Among Colored People was the way to move forward. The defeat of the Sewanee Canon did not end the threat of segregation within the South. Now, think back to your U.S. history course, whether that was last week, last year, 4 decades ago, whatever it may have been. Think back to the fact that immediately after the Civil War, in the southern states, we began to see blacks voting. And indeed, in 1870 or 1872, the state of Mississippi elected a black senator. And it wasn't the only place, the only southern state that had elected black representatives at varying levels. Of course, there was a backlash to that within the South in general, because obviously the aftermath of the war was felt worse in the South than in the North. And so part of the backlash was trying to get back on our feet, and why does it feel like these colored people are getting back on their feet better than all of our good white Southern boys? So anyway, the Southern Diocese, oh, thank you. How'd you know I needed that?
A little bird told me.
So anyway, in the Southern Diocese in the 1880s, they voted to limit black participation within the diocesan convention. So what they did, when they couldn't do it super geographically, within each diocese, they created colored convocations. So in other words, colored parishes, let's pick on South Carolina again, in the Diocese of South Carolina, colored parishes would be part of a convocation within the diocese. Now there probably were 2, one in the Charleston area and one in Columbia. Yeah?
What's a convocation?
Well, a convocation doesn't matter whether we're talking about the church or we're talking about academia. A convocation is merely a gathering. It's a fancy word for gathering people together, okay? And so what they would do is they would establish a colored convocation, let's say in Charleston, and a colored convocation in Columbia. Members of the colored Episcopal congregations would go to those convocations. From those convocations, they were allotted 4 seats at the diocesan convention.
So how many convocations of the alternative church was there?
Well, you see, the alternative was that every parish in the Diocese of South Carolina was allotted X number of representatives to diocesan convention. So every white parish, let's say that the number was 4. Every white parish would have 4 delegates to diocesan convention. I don't know how many colored parishes there may have been in South Carolina, but let's say that there were 6. 3 in Columbia area and 3 in the Charleston area. They got 4.
They still only got 1. And the white parishes weren't limited to that.
Right. Each parish that was historically white Whatever the Constitution and canons
So
said.
make sure that the larger number of black people who lived there, because there were so many slaves set free, didn't have the overwhelming vote.
Right. And bear in mind, way back when, sometime back in February, you might remember that I said that in the state of South Carolina, blacks outnumbered whites before the Civil War. So, you know, that's why I'm picking on South Carolina, because it was one of the states that supported this kind of thing, but all of them were supporting it as a way of protecting their vested interests. Anyway, this was also, the 1880s was also, 70s and 80s was also a time when the Episcopal Church believed that they could be a forerunner in trying to create a national church. Not just a national Episcopal Church, but a national church.
So were they trying to become the Church of the United States?
Well, they didn't have a name for it, but they were trying, unlike 50 years before, they were trying to bring into one flock Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Congregationalists, etc. Such a national organization would not therefore be concentrated in any geographical area per se, or within any particular ethnic group, all right? And they saw this national church as having a representative form of government. One of the things, you gotta love us, we never can get away from that representative form of government. You know, we picked it up right there at Independence Hall, and we've kept it going. But this national church would be committed to the traditional Christian faith, and it would provide a model of a democratic organization in Christ. Fancy language. A man named William Reed Huntington was its biggest proponent. He was also a proponent of more liturgical flexibility. Bear in mind that by the time you get to the 1880s, the 1789 prayer book is almost 100 years old and hasn't been changed. So he wanted to revise in terms of making the Episcopal Church more attractive to be the leader in this movement. He also believed that the liturgy needed to be useful to a broader segment of the population than the 1789 prayer book was. So in 1883, he presented to convention something called the Book Annex. And we do this all the time. We did this in the 60s and 70s before the 79 prayer book came out. We roll out something that's going to suggest what the changes might be. And the book Annex included prayers for industrial workers. It included short midday prayers and a greater variety of worship. That was presented to convention in 1883. Anytime you want to change something in the prayer book, it takes 2 presentations to General Convention. When they came back in 1886, General Convention said that Huntington's proposals were way too radical. They argued that the guiding principle for any prayer book revision needed to be that there would be no amendments prompted by doctrine and no alterations to the liturgy of the Holy Communion. Basically, their problem was they didn't know what they wanted to do. They couldn't figure it out. And so there they sat. So they come back 3 years later in 1889, and they still can't decide what they want to do about revising the prayer book. It was not until 1892 that General Convention would finally present a new prayer book without any kind of partisan animosity. Up until then, you had Anglo-Catholics wanting this changed, You had evangelicals wanting that changed or not changed, as the case may be. And it was not until 1892. So it took 9 years for them to go from initial discussion to actually happening. The 1892 Book of Common Prayer did create greater flexibility, as Huntington wanted.
Was it enough?
Well, I guess one might say it lasted until 1928, so, 30 years isn't so bad, right? But, the funny thing is, I'm about to tell you what some of that flexibility is, and you're going to look at me and go, huh? For example, the 1892 prayer book said that on weekdays in the Eucharist, you could omit the exhortation. So some of you are looking at me like, what's the exhortation? Well, Lisa, can you just hand me any one of those prayer books right there? Oh, I forgot you were tethered.
Okay.
Thanks. The exhortation has been in the prayer book since 1549. And it precedes the Right One section of the 79 prayer book. It is still there. The exhortation says, the rubric says, this may be used in whole or in part, either during the liturgy or at other times. This is how it begins. Beloved in the Lord, our Savior Jesus Christ, on the night before he suffered, instituted the sacrament of his body and blood as a sign and pledge of his love, for the continual remembrance of the sacrifice of his death, and for a spiritual sharing in his risen life. For in these holy mysteries we are made one with Christ, and Christ with us. We are made one body in him, and members of one another. And it goes on for almost a total of 2 pages. And it's an exhortation to, if you're one in Christ, these are the things you should be doing in your life. Here's how you should live. You should be examining your life and conduct by the rule of God's commandments, that you may perceive wherein you have offended in what you have done or left undone, whether in thought, word, or deed. And it then goes right into the 10 Commandments, not the way we did them 2 weeks ago. But it goes right into the 10 Commandments. Now, that was required at any Eucharist under the 1789 prayer book.
So they must have suffered a lot of people not being able to show up for Eucharist Monday through Friday because of work. So.
Well, see, now you're beginning to see the differences post-Civil War. We've got a much more industrial, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, we have a much more industrial world in which the Episcopal Church is operating. And somebody who wants to come to morning Eucharist on a weekday does not have time to have the entire exhortation, all 10 Commandments read, and then we move on to Blessed be God. Okay? So, that was one piece of flexibility. In morning prayer, and the Right One morning prayer begins somewhere around page 50, if my memory is correct. A little before that, let's try 40. The collects are around page 50. Yeah, page 56 in particular. If you have a prayer book in front of you, on page 56 are the prayers for morning prayer. In the 1789 prayer book, everything that you see there on 56 and 57 had to be read every time you did morning prayer.
Every single one of them. A specific one.
Not the way, for example, when we've done evening prayer on Wednesday nights, there may be a whole bunch of them there, but we'll pick 2 out of the 4 or 5. No, they had to read them all. Okay? So, another piece of flexibility was morning prayer could omit the prayers after the 3rd collect. The first 3 had to be said. In addition, the 1892 prayer book added a penitential office, which you will find in the 79 prayer book immediately preceding both Rite 1 and Rite 2 Eucharist. So, in Rite 1, it's probably somewhere around page 319, give or take.
Yeah.
Okay? it's trivia. I can't tell you why I walked down the hall, but I can tell you trivia like this, okay? It included prayers for the mission and unity of God's people, okay? Remember, Huntington was busy trying to create a national church. So now we have prayers in the prayer book for that kind of a mission. The Benedictus is one of the canticles for either morning prayer or evening prayer. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. He has redeemed his people. It's a bad rendering of it. But anyway, it was in there, but it was a shortened version of it. And Huntington got them to put the entire original version of it. And
They went from shortening, now they're long.
yeah, they are, exactly. Flexibility. Part of doing that was for Anglo-Catholics. That's not a criticism or a comment about them, but if they were going to use the 1892 prayer book, it needed some additions to it, such as it also restored the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis to evening prayer. They had been taken out in the 1789 prayer book.
Too Catholic?
Well, they wouldn't have used that word in 1789, but they would have said that they were too Roman in 1789. It's a funny morphosizing. In 1789, such things were Roman.
Okay.
And they were Roman because they had Latin names: Benedictus, Magnificat, Nunc Dimittis. Okay?
So would they not have English translations and therefore people didn't understand them and that's why they...
No, there were English translations, but they were considered holdovers from the old Roman liturgy. Okay? And so they were in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer in England, but over here, they went out in 1789. With the advent of Anglo-Catholicism in the 1840s in this country and its continued growth, if they were going to have a prayer book that might appeal to the Diocese of Wisconsin and the Diocese of Chicago and the various dioceses that were taking on a very Anglo-Catholic feel, then it had to be a prayer book that had some of these things in it, because otherwise they were going to object to it.
Okay, great.
So that's part of its flexibility. The 1892 prayer book added the Feast of the Transfiguration. August 6th is the Feast of the Transfiguration. That was not a feast in the 1789 prayer book. As a matter of fact, most of the feast days in the 1789 prayer book dealt with either events in the life of Jesus or his apostles. Now you might say to me, but isn't it the transfiguration of Jesus? Yes, but again, it was considered Romish. Okay? They also, in the late 80s and early 90s, put forward, or at least Huntington put forward, something called the Chicago Quadrilateral. And now that you have a prayer book in front of you, we're going to go to the back where the historical documents are, and you'll find it on 876.
I thought a quadrilateral was a shape.
Yeah.
Or side.
I was going to say, what's at the basis of it?
Yeah.
All right, exactly. And
876.
the quadrilateral that was hammered out in Chicago was an outline of 4 basic elements which the Episcopal Church would expect in a national church. Those 4 elements: sola scriptura, the centrality of Scripture; the Nicene Creed; sacraments, 2; and the historic episcopate, adapted in various ways in local circumstances. Such national church themes in the late 80s and early 90s were not just being put forward here in the United States, they were being put forward in Canada and in England. And so what you see, if you look on page 877, it says Lambeth Conference of 1888, Resolution 11. This Chicago Quadrilateral was brought to the Lambeth Conference in 1888, suggesting a way forward for the establishment of national churches, not just in the U.S., but in various other parts of the Anglican Communion. Lambeth adopted Huntington's Quadrilateral, saying that it was the basis on which an approach may be, by God's blessing, made towards home reunion. They still had this idea that we could have one church on earth, and wanted desperately to push that forward. The Quadrilateral, as you see here in the prayer book, made conversation with other churches possible. You see, because of its 4 points, what it did is it got you to a starting point that wasn't chasubles, preaching tabs, surplices and catholics, you know, all the kind of stuff. I mean, people weren't any different back then than today, okay? You know, if we're not careful, if you're trying to start a really deep conversation, where today does it tend to start? It starts on what we call adiaphora, you know, the things that are not important. That's what adiaphora means. Or it starts with emotion. And so what not the best places at all to begin what needs to be a deep and at times perhaps difficult conversation. So the Quadrilateral and its 4 points looked like a way to cut through emotion and cut through all that other kind of stuff. Many people in the Episcopal Church welcomed such a dialogue. However,
Well, in the other churches,
well, it's not even the other churches. Anglo-Catholics were kind of leery of this idea of trying to pull together a national church.
what was their reason?
Well, they didn't want a Protestant national church. Instead, what they wanted for Western liturgy to acknowledge their roots in the Roman liturgy and bring those, by acknowledging that, make those ties more important. Okay?
So the Magnificat and the
Nunc Dimittis?
wasn't enough?
Well, see, remember, that was in the 1892 prayer book. What we're talking about now is this attempt to have this national church. And Anglo-Catholics would have been a massive minority. Think about it. Anglo-Catholics, if we had a national church that was Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Congregationalists, they might have even wanted the Unitarians in there. They might have even welcomed the Baptists in there. Where would Anglo-Catholics fit in the midst of all those? Presbyterians I didn't even mention. Where would Anglo-Catholics be in the midst of such a conglomeration?
About 5%.
Yeah, they would be lost, okay? And if their presence wasn't felt, then their deep-seated feeling was that their liturgical ideas and desires would be lost, okay?
Is that why the deputies never approved it? Because they were more Anglo-Catholic?
No. The vision was held by a group of people who did not necessarily have their thumb on the pulse of the Episcopal Church nationwide. That's pretty much why nothing really came of this, okay? it also, such a vision was left over from a time in US history that was long gone. So the vision was emerging from people grounded back in who the country was, 1812, 1815, 1825, something like that. We're now talking 1880s and 1890s. As I hinted at a minute ago, this was no longer a country of farmers. It was not even really a country of small factories or mom and pop operations. We were becoming an industrial giant. And in becoming an industrial giant, people in the pew are looking at the church with a different set of eyes. For example, different set of eyes, and looking at the Episcopal Church itself with a different set of eyes. 1836, 1 in every 400 Americans was an Episcopalian.
It doesn't sound like a lot.
Well, I'm not sure, you know what, I forgot to write down what the population of the country was in 1836. Bear in mind, in 1836, the states were only going out, we only had states out to the Mississippi.
Okay.
Missouri was a state, Wisconsin was a state. So when I say the Mississippi, I mean right along either side of the Mississippi, okay? So, we're what, 350 million now? Don't even think about those kind of numbers, okay? In 1906, 1 out of every 95 Americans was an Episcopalian. So what that...
30 years, they went from...
No, that was 70 years. 1836 to 1906. Now what that's saying is the way in which people like Huntington and others thought of the Episcopal Church as being leaders to make a national church happen was based on a time when 1 out of every 400 Americans was an Episcopalian. Now it's 1 out of 95. Life is changing. Why is it changing? Well, what happened between 36 and the turn of the century? Well, you had a potato famine. That brought a whole bunch of people in the 1840s. In the 50s and 60s, you had people coming in from the Mediterranean countries. You had, by the 1870s and 80s, you had them coming in from what we would today call Eastern Europe and Russia. On the West Coast, you have them coming in from Japan and China. So all I'm trying to get at is, all of a sudden, the makeup of the country is changing drastically. And what General Convention realized was they needed to do a bit more work on themselves than worrying about trying to make the Episcopal Church the leaders of some big movement.
There were too few and far between at that point to make a big thing, right?
Right. And think about it, 1880s, 1890s, oh yeah, as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, the railroad was going across the country, but getting across the country still took you forever, okay? And still had some dangers of trying to get from point A to point B.
We also acquired about half of our country in that time period too. We actually physically weren't the United States of that larger space.
Right, oh no, that's absolutely correct. And actually, to that end, between 1867 and 1912, 9 new states came into the United States. Nebraska, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. So to the point that Lisa just made, think geographically, that's a whole swath of the United States that took on a new role within the country, and that forced the Episcopal Church to take on a new role in terms of the territories.
Now they had to get out there and establish parishes.
Exactly. And that required a different thinking than, let's say, 60, 70 years before. You've probably heard Ben say, one of his jokes about the Episcopal Church is, the Baptists and the Methodists got on horseback and went over the Appalachians and got out to western Kentucky, western Tennessee, the Midwest states. The Episcopalians waited for the motor car to take them over. At one level, there is some truth. The other side of it is that if you look at, for example, the history of a place like the Diocese of Missouri, it was established by Episcopalians who came west from Virginia. However, when you start looking at Utah and Montana, you don't have Virginia Episcopalians moving out there. You just have people moving west and looking for a church. So it meant that we needed to begin to look at what we were going to do. This is also a time when you have more Americans living in cities and towns than on farms, from 1880 until the turn of the century. So the country is becoming more complicated in a number of ways, but it's also becoming a bit more efficient. We can get to places in a way that we couldn't do it 60, 70 years before. It was also a time when, because we were moving west, the church began to realize we can't bring everybody from Montana and Colorado back to General Seminary in New York or back to Virginia Seminary.
So they need to get more seminaries.
So this was a time, 1883, they established the Western Seminary in Minneapolis. 1893, they established the Church Divinity School of the Pacific in California. So we're realizing that this whole vision of having a national church, may be nice, but we've really got to sink our own roots down a bit deeper in various parts of the country. In 1880, there were 50 dioceses in the Episcopal Church. In 1910, there were 87. Now remember, we started with 13 in 1789. So we're growing. And bear in mind, in 1789, a state was a diocese.
I was going to say, the dioceses start to get smaller.
They started to get smaller. New York, the state of New York, under John Henry Hobart and Benjamin Moore, Samuel Prevost, that was one diocese. And Hobart was, you may recall, he was the guy who believed in administration and he wanted to visit parishes and all like that. Well, think about visiting parishes by carriage or horseback in New York State in the early to mid 1800s.
That must have been rough.
Well, incredibly rough. And so he realized that they needed to establish additional dioceses. And so that began the process of states dividing, dioceses dividing, I should say. And with more dioceses, General Convention takes on a different look. So General Convention, by the 1890s, realized that they couldn't just do their work out of the bishop's office in the back of the cathedral in the diocese from which the presiding bishop came. That they needed to have a national place, a central place, where people knew how to get a hold of someone. And so in the 1890s, we established a central place in New York City. Yeah.
It was central at the time.
Well, it was partly because New York, even then, had an aura about it. One might say, why not St. Louis? Well, St. Louis in the 1890s was still considered something like a poor river town.
So, but New York has the lakes, so you can get by boat, trains.
Right. You can get to Europe from there. You can get trains out to the west. You can go around.
Yeah.
Cape Horn to, not Tierra del Fuego to get to the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. So, anyway, we will pick it up there and move on to what's coming up with the turn of the century, and again, big changes coming into the Episcopal Church. So, bear in mind, we won't be picking it up until April the 8th. Palm Sunday and Easter Day, no class. All right? Excellent. Thank you all.